Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Holden. He's professor of psychology and principal investigator of the Personality and Romantic Relationships Lab at Appalachian State University in the US. His research focuses on topics like personality and evolutionary psychology, romantic relationships, the HEXACO model of personality, self-esteem, main retention behavior, and others. So, Dr. Holden, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Okay, great. So, let me first ask you a general question before we get into personality traits and main retention behaviors and stuff like that. How do you look at the relationship between personality psychology and evolutionary psychology? Because you do a bit of both, right?
Right, yeah, and that's a great question. I think that there's a lot that we can gain by looking at, both of these fields and thinking about how they come together. Often I'm kind of thinking about personality from this perspective of, evolution by natural selection. How has this shaped the traits? How has this given us maybe some deeper insight to the traits that we often talk about in personality psychology? Yeah, again, I think there's a lot that we can really do to marry those two approaches. Um, so we might talk a little bit about how, certain aspects of the environment or certain evolutionary pressures are shaping aspects of personality. And I think, by combining these things, we're really building the strongest models of personality possible. And we see this show up in a few different ways. I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but, with the HEXACO model of personality, you mentioned that in the intro. There's a lot that was done there to really think about these traits from an evolutionary perspective and how they may have helped us solve adaptive problems. With that, they've even got some interstitial traits like altruism versus antagonism. And they did that to really kind of map onto what we see in the non-human world as well. So I like to think of these things as complementing each other. I don't think that, either one field or the other has all of the answers or the best answers. So again, I think just really kind of bringing them together to strengthen those two perspectives. I haven't done much personally to really look at personality from an evolutionary perspective. I'm often relying on the work of other people. So folks like David Buss have done quite a bit with this, and David Schmidt as well. And then also the folks that developed the HEXACO, like I said, have done a lot to really highlight those evolutionary underpinnings. So I haven't done too much, but I'm usually using it as kind of a way to build the foundation for the work that I'm doing and just kind of shaping the way that I think about those traits.
Mhm. In your work, you use the hexaco model of personality, but I mean, at least as far as I understand it, the most used model of personality in personality psychology is the Big Five. So, is the hexaco better than the Big Five, or is it better at least to understand certain aspects of people's personality and behavior that we can't really understand by using the Big Five?
All right, yeah. So I might stir the pot a little bit when I say this, but I'll go ahead and say it. I think it's a better model overall. And I say that as someone who was heavily steeped and trained in the Big Five. But one of the things I like about the Hexaco, again, is that it's pulling from that evolutionary perspective. But they also kind of started from this point of using the Big Five and realizing that it was falling short, particularly in some cross-cultural contexts. So Michael Ashton and Kibyum Lee were the folks that really kind of developed the Hexaco model. And they were looking at some differences in Eastern and Western samples. And every time they tried to validate the Big Five, they kept seeing the sixth factor of honesty, humility pop up. And they saw it a little bit more strongly in Eastern cultures. I think it's just adding some variances, giving us a deeper understanding of these traits. There's some revisions to aspects of the Big Five, but you can pretty much think of the Hexaco as the Big Five plus honesty, humility. I think it doesn't unnecessarily add another variable. I would say it's actually providing good insight and giving us some detail there. I also really like it because we can start to make the bridge into dark personality traits by looking at honesty, humility. So we tend to see that things like narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, these things are negatively correlated, and usually quite strongly negatively correlated with honesty, humility. So when I teach about this in class, sometimes I propose it as, well, this is a 6-factor model of personality, but it's almost eking into this territory of being a 9 or, a 10-factor model of personality if you throw in some of the other dark personality traits there, like sadism. So yeah, I think it really just pins down a lot of different things and allows us to start looking at broader connections. So those would be the things that I would point to in making that argument. I don't know if Big Five folks would have counterpoints to that, but yeah, it's certainly, at least in my research, has allowed me to really start understanding things that we may not have seen with some aspects of the Big Five.
So let's apply those personality traits to try to understand some human behaviors. Let's start with mate retention strategy. So
Sure.
how are personality traits associated with that?
Yeah, this is a great question because it kind of goes back to what you opened with, where we're blending this approach of, using evolutionary theory and personality theory. And there's a lot of really interesting connections. So the way that I think about it is, there's this whole range of mate retention behaviors. And it includes things like, showing love and affection for your partner, all the things that we would do, or you might typically think of doing to maintain the relationship, to some pretty negative and, derogatory things towards the partner or towards rivals. So it really kind of runs this gamut. David Buss put it as ranging from vigilance to violence. I think looking at those, it's interesting because now we have this map of what people do in relationships and how they go about maintaining those. But there's still this question of, why do we have such a range, and are there different people that are going to fall into different types of these mate retention behaviors? And I think personality, and particularly the HEXACO, really allows us to start seeing some of that. So in some of my own work, I've looked at the HEXACO, particularly things like honesty, humility, and how that influences mate retention. And kind of in short, what we tend to see is that folks that score higher in this trait of honesty, humility, folks that are more concerned with treating people fairly and acting in this sincere way, basically make for really good partners, right? So they're doing things like all of the benefit provisioning behaviors, where you're showing love and affection for your partner, maybe helping them with a certain task. All of these things that signal that you're investing in the relationship, and that it's going to be beneficial for your partner to continue investing in the relationship. So I think that's a really interesting connection. We see some connections with the Big Five as well, with things like agreeableness and conscientiousness. But yeah, it really just helps us answer this question of, why are different people using, or which people are using different mate retention behaviors.
So is it the case that the traits from the HEXACO model, some of them are positively correlated with healthy, long-during relationships, and others are correlated negatively with that? Does it work that way?
Yeah, we can get close to that. I'm always hesitant to say, these are the things that make for a good partner, they make for the best relationships, because I think there's just going to be so much variability from relationship to relationship. But yeah, I think certainly we can see that there are certain patterns, and there are things that I would say would lead to, at least kind of at the level of averages, better relationships and healthier relationships. So I mentioned honesty, humility. I think that's a big one. Kind of more broadly, just in relationship science in general, we tend to see things like, things that would be associated with conscientiousness and agreeableness are really good predictors of, the length of relationships, satisfaction within relationships. So I would point to those as well. It's interesting because conscientiousness, you don't think of conscientiousness as being something interpersonal, right? It's kind of how someone structures their life and how they tend to prefer, certain patterns of organization. But it seems as though that really kind of carries over, maybe particularly if we have folks that are high in agreeableness, or maybe also high in honesty, humility. it carries over in how they see their partner, and they're kind of taking the same diligence that they would use to regulate themselves and using that to regulate their relationships in a positive way. Now that I say that, it sounds kind of manipulative, right? But they're interested in maintaining those things and promoting those. On the negative side, we tend to see folks that are disagreeable, so they score low on that trait of agreeableness, tend to maybe engage in some of those more negative mate retention behaviors or just relationship behaviors broadly. Some research suggesting that things like higher levels of extroversion, people at a higher risk for infidelity. So maybe just through interacting with a number of different people and kind of engaging with those folks, it opens up the opportunity for either mate poaching or just breaking up with a relationship and moving into a new one. When we kind of get outside of that a little bit, if you're interested, there's things like self-esteem and how that predicts relationship functioning and relationship success. And kind of the takeaway there is that folks that are higher or have higher self-esteem tend to make for better partners and have higher relationship satisfaction and longer lasting relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will come back to self-esteem later on in the interview. When we talk about mate retention strategies, are there different categories of them, or how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so that's something that's really helpful, I think, to go back to. And there's a few different ways of slicing up mate retention behaviors. So they kind of run this pretty wide gamut of vigilance to violence or kind of negative to positive. And usually people will talk about two broad domains of mate retention. So kind of going top down. We tend to divide it, or at least I personally tend to divide it into those benefit provisioning behaviors and cost inflicting behaviors. So kind of ultimately they both serve the same goal. They want to maintain the relationship and prevent defection. But they kind of get through those things by different means. Right? So again, with benefit provisioning, we tend to see that they're trying to incentivize, these behaviors are targeted at incentivizing staying in the relationship. So you're signaling to your partner that you're investing, and then that's worthwhile for them to kind of reinvest in you. In cost inflicting, you're making it costly to leave the relationship. So should the partner defect, there's going to be a high risk or high rate of cost associated with that. So that's where some of the derogatory comments come in to kind of maybe change the way the partner sees themselves. There's also derogatory comments towards potential rivals. So kind of bringing down their perceived mate value by engaging in those behaviors. So those would be the two big domains. Sometimes people will talk about intersexual versus intrasexual manipulation as two broader domains as well. So that would be kind of what you're doing to manipulate or influence your partner versus potential rivals. I haven't used that distinction quite as much in my own research. But then below those two dimensions are a number of different categories. So there we tend to see things like direct guarding, vigilance. I should have had the chart in front of me. I always forget which piece is piece because or which piece falls where because I'm so focused on the domains. But there's categories under those. There's 5 different categories. And then there's actually tactics below that. So you can get down to the level of very specific behaviors and start seeing those.
Mm-hmm. Do these domains and categories go associated with sets of personality traits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, kind of depending on the trait and depending on which line of research you look at, you can start to see different patterns. But yeah, I would say in general, scores on honesty, humility are going to be associated with, particularly high scores are going to be associated with more of those benefit provisioning and all the categories that would be underneath that. Things like agreeableness, high scores on agreeableness will kind of push people into more of those benefit provisioning behaviors. Also on the low end of agreeableness, we tend to see stronger associations with cost inflicting. Conscientiousness, we tend to see people who are more conscientious engage in more of those benefit provisioning behaviors. So we can kind of start seeing some patterns there. It also gets interesting if you move into some of the dark personality traits, particularly things like Machiavellianism. We tend to see being associated with some of those cost-inflicting behaviors. Narcissism, it depends kind of on which category you're looking at under those domains, or even which tactic, but we do tend to see some associations there. And then there's also some interesting connections when you start moving into more pathological models of personality. So kind of looking at things that would be associated with certain personality disorders through things like the PID-5, which kind of mirrors the alternate model for diagnosis of personality disorders, and really also kind of mirrors the big five. So there you're talking about traits like negative affect and detachment, where negative affect would be kind of an analog to neuroticism, and detachment would be an analog to extroversion. And kind of following that, we see similar patterns. So folks that are higher in negative affect tend to engage in more of those cost-inflicting behaviors. And folks that are detached, kind of interestingly, seem to be, as you might expect, I guess, kind of removed. But when they do engage in mate retention behaviors, it does seem to be more in line with those cost-inflicting behaviors.
This just came to my mind now. Do these things connect in any way with attachment styles? Because, I mean, those also predict, at least to some extent, how people establish romantic relationships, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I myself haven't looked into that quite as much. Someone who's been on your show, though, has, Nicole Barbaro. So she's done some interesting work with that. Other folks have as well. And I'm rusty on this, so I apologize. But from what I remember, the more secure attachment style seems to be associated with more of those benefit provisioning behaviors. So it would fall in line pretty much as you would expect from what I remember. Now, I don't know if it would really depend on how you break up insecure attachment styles, because there's a few different ways to look at those. So some people will focus on kind of the disorganized versus the detached and things like that. So there might be something more there, but I'd imagine if anything, they're going to engage in those cost-inflicting behaviors.
Mm-hmm. I know that you've studied the relationship between a personality trait, in this case agreeableness, and the performance of oral sex. When it's man to woman or male to female. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in that case, it was mostly looking at heterosexual men and their agreeableness and how that influenced their mate retention behaviors and whether or not they engaged in oral sex and at what frequency. That was a really interesting project because it was really marrying a lot of different lines of research. So far we've kind of talked about how personality and mate retention come together and inform what's happening in relationships. So here we were kind of tacking on oral sex as part of that. And that starts to get into some of the stuff with sperm competition theory, and kind of moving into whether or not some of the adaptations that we see in the non-human realm kind of cross over into the human realm. But the basic idea there was that engaging in oral sex was kind of an extension of these benefit provisioning behaviors that we would typically see. And we do tend to see a strong correlation between agreeableness and benefit provisioning behaviors. So it stands to reason that, we would see ultimately kind of what we saw in the model there, where folks that are higher, or men who are higher in agreeableness and who are performing more of these benefit provisioning behaviors, tend to also engage in more of those oral sex behaviors. It was really kind of fun to see that come together. I think there was a lot of good theory behind it, but you never know going into it. It was partially mediated, right? So we can't really make the strongest claims there of mediation, but it does seem like men who are more agreeable and who engage in more of those benefit provisioning behaviors are more likely to engage in oral sex. And this is also interesting because it taps into what we know from relationship science more broadly. We tend to see that folks that are agreeable are kind of willing to, perspective take and do more to kind of find that common ground with their partner. We could argue that engaging in oral sex would be kind of part of that, or, thinking about your partner's sexual pleasure would be something that could motivate that. So it was kind of a way to see, all these systems line up and all of these different backgrounds line up. So it was a really cool paper in the end.
Mhm. Yeah. You also study humor. So do you tackle it from an evolutionary perspective, or is it more from a personality psychology perspective?
Yeah, it's a little more in the camp of from a personality psychology perspective.
Yeah.
Uh, just a little bit of background on that. When I was earning my master's, I was involved in a lab with Dr. Tom Ford, who studies humor and studies the prejudice releasing effects of humor. So he's kind of studying it from a social psychological lens there. And kind of the basic idea that he's been working on is how does humor affect interpersonal interactions and perceptions of other people? So often there, what we're looking at is, the different styles or types of humor and how that's influencing relationships or how it's influencing the person. So, one of the papers there was looking at different humor styles and whether or not that correlated with some of the things that we kind of wrap up into subjective well-being or happiness. So in that case, it was really kind of like a personality variable. But in some of the other work, it's looking at more of the social dynamics and how humor can influence interactions. So not much really from an evolutionary perspective there. I know there's some folks out there that have done some stuff with humor from an evolutionary perspective. That's really fascinating stuff. But yeah, I kind of take off my evolutionary psych hat and put on a more of a social personality psych hat with that research.
Yeah. What are these humor styles? I mean, do they have different, do they fall into different categories as not the personality traits, but the mate retention strategies or not?
Yeah, so we can kind of talk about four different humor styles. So it is similar to the mate retention behaviors where we kind of have one camp that we might say is more positive and one camp that's a little more negative. So within the positive camp, we tend to talk about affiliative humor styles and then also self-enhancing humor styles. So affiliative would be, using humor to build connections with the people that you're interacting with. Self-enhancing would be using humor in a way that makes light of the situation without really kind of detracting from the person. It's almost kind of like mindfulness in a way, or just having that perspective of, um, you know, maybe I had this bad situation pop up, but that's just part of it. You make a joke about how awful it is and you move on. And that seems to be associated with some of those aspects of subjective well-being, as does that affiliative style. But then in the negative camp, where we have aggressive forms of humor. So there it might be cracking jokes at the expense of other people, or maybe in more extreme cases, using someone as an example, kind of stereotyping or something like that, using that as part of the joke. And then there's also kind of this fourth style of self-debasing humor. Forgetting, that's not the actual term there. I'm drawing a blank.
Self-deprecating.
Self-deprecating, yeah. Yeah, and with self-deprecating, it's pretty much as it sounds. So, they'd be making fun of themselves and making jokes about themselves, and that tends to be associated with some negative self-views and can actually kind of detract from subjective well-being.
Since we're also talking about romantic relationships, does humor play an important role in them?
Yeah, that's another great question. Personally, I haven't done much to marry those two lines of research. So I haven't looked at humor in the context of romantic relationships, but I know other folks have, and I know it's kind of an important variable. So, kind of from start to finish, humor and kind of similarity in humor does seem to be predictive of relationship success. So, being funny is typically attractive, right? So that would be something that would initiate that relationship. But then, I think one thing that happens in relationships, particularly long-term relationships, is that, people actually become more similar. So there's interesting research on how personality shifts as people are in long-term relationships. And I would imagine the same thing would be happening with humor and kind of the humor styles that people engage in. And if I had to hazard a guess, I'd imagine that what happens over time with humor in romantic relationships is that people kind of develop their own systems of jokes and inside jokes and things that they find funny. And that would kind of promote the relationship and would make people happier, more satisfied with their relationship, and would really kind of deepen those connections with their partner. Totally speaking, I know that, my partner and I, we have our own system of humor, and if someone were to pop in, it would sound like we're off our rockers. But yeah, imagine humor would kind of carry about the relationship through multiple stages.
Can we know if someone is happy or unhappy based on their humor style?
Yeah, another great question. And I would probably preface it by saying I'm not someone who's quite as steeped in positive psychology and happiness studies in general. But yeah, I mean, I think kind of in the same way that we could say that, certain relationship behaviors promote satisfaction in those relationships, certain humor styles are going to do many of the same things, maybe just in a more broader interpersonal context. So someone who's using those affiliative forms of humor, those self-enhancing forms of humor, that's going to be perceived by other people. They're kind of signaling to others, I would say, how they view themselves. That's going to kind of be reciprocated back to them. And all of that would kind of come together to promote, things like higher self-esteem, happiness, and all of those things overall. So, yeah, I think it would be one of the many factors that would go into that, but I think it would be a pretty good one. And the opposite would be true if they were using some of those self-deprecating or aggressive forms of humor.
So let's now talk about self-esteem. Earlier, you've already mentioned the relationship between self-esteem and if someone has a good, long-lasting relationship or not. So could you tell us again about that?
Yeah, so there's a long line of research from folks like Sandra Murray. Some of it I've done as well, and some other folks have kind of brought all these different components of self-esteem together. But in general, we talk about self-esteem being high or low. So it has high self-esteem, that's more positive evaluations. If you use the sociometer model, which I think is a really compelling argument for self-esteem, it's also suggesting that they're getting signals of inclusion from other people, and that's bolstering self-esteem. Whereas the opposite would be true with low self-esteem. So with low self-esteem, we're going to have more negative views of the self, and that'd be signals of exclusion, which particularly in an evolutionary environment would be costly. So we would argue that, self-esteem is kind of this adaptation that tracks status. Ultimately, it kind of changes how we see ourselves and shapes our self-views, but it's coming from this interpersonal domain. And I like that framework because it really allows you to start moving into what it does in relationships pretty easily. So folks that are higher in self-esteem tend to report greater relationship satisfaction. Their partners tend to report greater relationship satisfaction. And I think some of the more interesting findings there are that, when faced with challenges in relationships, people with high self-esteem kind of take it in stride, and they think about, as opposed to being defensive and kind of removing themselves from that problem, they think about solutions to it, and they're often focused on solutions that are kind of really incorporating their partner's perspective. So it's less of a dead end for them, and it's more of just maybe a bump in the road. The opposite's true with folks with low self-esteem. So folks with low self-esteem who are in romantic relationships will take on more of that defensive approach, and will kind of retract from their partner, or in other cases will even kind of start to derogate their partner in an attempt to maybe change their partner's views of themselves and kind of bring down their partner's self-esteem. So it's much more of a defensive strategy versus this kind of communal relationship building strategy that we would see with high self-esteem.
Is high self-esteem associated with some personality traits and low self-esteem with others?
Yeah, in general, we can see some connections. Some of these are a little muddier than others, but with, if we're coming from Big Five or HEXACO, we tend to see usually positive correlations between extroversion and self-esteem. One aspect of extroversion is actually social self-esteem. Resurgency is kind of that's been used for quite a while with extroversion. So we do tend to see a positive correlation there, and it's what allows extroverted people to be extroverted. If we move into some of the dark personality traits, that's where I'd say we start to see stronger connections with self-esteem. So of course with narcissism, which by definition is this exaggerated self-view, we tend to see pretty strong positive correlations with self-esteem and narcissism. We see similar correlations with other aspects of the dark triad, but I'd say really narcissism is kind of driving that. Going back to some of the stuff with the big five, there are some connections usually with things like agreeableness, conscientiousness. If you move into HEXACO, some of those hold as well. Agreeableness is slightly shifted around to basically incorporate that sixth factor, but we still see some connections there. And if I remember correctly, we tend to see positive correlations between honesty, humility, and self-esteem, high self-esteem.
Mm-hmm. What is relationship-contingent self-esteem?
Yeah, so within self-esteem, we usually, at least as I was describing it, we're kind of framing it as what we might call secure self-esteem, or just kind of your typical overall self-esteem. But an interesting line of research that's, I would say, is a little more recent is getting into what we might call fragile forms of self-esteem. And within fragile, we have contingent forms of self-esteem. Right? So fragile, by definition, would be feelings of self-worth that are kind of tenuous. They rely on input from other people, and they're going to be variable. Secure, on the other hand, particularly secure high self-esteem, these folks are resilient. Their views of themselves are resilient, and they're not going to be fazed by any one thing. So again, within fragile, we talk about contingent. Contingent gets its name from the fact that these folks are basically staking their self-worth on a particular area in life or a particular domain of life. And there's been a number of these proposed. I don't think by any means those are exhaustive. I think in any domain of life that you can be getting feedback, you could have contingent self-esteem. And what that would mean is that successes and failures in that domain, how you do or how you perceive yourself as succeeding or failing, is going to determine your overall views of self or your overall self-esteem. So then relationship contingent self-esteem occurs when someone is kind of narrowly focused on their relationship, both whether they're in one and also the kind of nature of it, whether they're satisfied with it, to determine their views of themselves. So any sort of event within the relationship is really going to drive folks with relationship contingent self-esteem to have different views of the self, right? So things are going well. That's a good sign. They might have more positive evaluations there. But even pretty small things like maybe arguing over what to have for dinner or something like that, to them could be seen as this huge failure or this huge sign of kind of the impending breakup or problems with the relationship, and that in turn is going to drive down their views of themselves. So they're very narrowly focused on that one domain, and that's determining their overall views of themselves. And with secure, on the other hand, we tend to see that people are kind of pulling from all of these different domains, and they're pulling from successes and failures in all of those domains. And so maybe they get a bad test grade, but everything else is going great and they're excited about what's happening in the weekend. So that's kind of balancing it out. And that's what allows it to be a little more resilient. So yeah, with relationship contingent self-esteem, they're just deriving feelings of self-worth from that romantic relationship.
Mm. Does it go associated with some personality traits?
Yeah, so we tend to see that, kind of first of all, there's a connection between self-esteem level and contingent self-esteem. So to see that folks that have any form of contingent, but particularly with relationship contingent self-esteem as well, we tend to see a lower overall self-esteem. But then, yeah, we do tend to see some connections with some of the HEXACO traits. They're a little muddy. They're not always, perfect. I've seen connections with honesty, humility, and agreeableness. But in other studies, I've seen those go away. So that's something I'm still kind of working on and trying to pin down a bit. We also see some connections with things like borderline personality disorder and symptoms of that. Not to say that relationship contingent self-esteem is pathological. We would consider it kind of in this realm of normal personality, but interesting in the sense that there's some similarity there, and I think a lot of it stems from kind of this strong focus and almost kind of obsession with the relationship, but also maybe some black and white thinking there, and kind of taking things out of proportion, and kind of seeing them as just being this sign of impending doom when they're really not. It's a small disagreement or maybe a small problem within the relationship. So that'd be kind of in a nutshell some of those connections there.
Yeah. So you've also studied the relationship between partner attractiveness, number of sexual rivals, and in-pair copulation frequency. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. That's also kind of going back to some of the stuff with the paper there on oral sex. And yeah, really kind of building off of what we know from sperm competition theory more broadly, and kind of seeing if we can map some of that onto human behavior, and seeing if what happens in the non-human world maps onto what humans are doing. So, in the non-human animal realm, we tend to see some adaptations, and one of those, some adaptations for sperm competition, and one of those is higher rates of copulation. So we tend to see this a lot in birds. They're a really good example for that. And copulation frequency in birds is pretty much directly correlated with sperm competition risk. So we were bringing that into the human realm, and one of the ways that we did that was by kind of, I would say indirectly, but still getting at sperm competition risk by looking at number of coworkers, number of potential rivals, basically. So again, this was in a heterosexual male context where we're looking at men's perceptions of sperm competition risk, men's perceptions of their partner, and how that influenced the in-pair copulation frequency, so copulation with the partner. And basically what we saw is that if the female partner had a higher number of friends or coworkers that were male, and the male partner saw their female partner as more attractive, there was a self-reported greater desire for copulation frequency. An argument there would be that there are kind of these psychological mechanisms that are assessing those risks of sperm competition, and that the male is trying to kind of counter that by engaging in more frequent sex with their partner. And then what that would do is increase the likelihood of reproductive success, also drive up paternal certainty, and would counter some of those risks from sperm competition.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one last question. Do you think that all of this knowledge that we have about personality and evolutionary psychology, that people could apply it to improve their romantic relationships?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's one I think about quite a bit. Sometimes I tell people, because when I tell people I studied relationships, they're often like, "Oh, so do you use that?" And my partner's also a psychologist, so then there's the question of like, are you guys analyzing each other? And I always tell people, first of all, I'm more of a data scientist than anything, but using this knowledge, this might make me sound like a total nerd, but using this knowledge is kind of like using the Force from Star Wars, right? So if you use it in the wrong way, it can corrupt you. But if you use it in the right way, it can be great. So I think that, if you used it in the appropriate way, it would be really helpful. And I would just caution people from going down the rabbit hole of worrying about, I have this negative view of myself, or I'm not feeling quite as strongly about myself right now. Does that mean that I'm going to, have this conflict with my partner? Am I going to start engaging in cost-inflicting behaviors? Maybe that's just my anxiety, but I can see how it's easy to start slipping into that. And that would, I would say, ultimately kind of be like shooting yourself in the foot, and would really just detract from the relationship. But yeah, I think using the knowledge and using it carefully can really help you in situations where maybe you and your partner are having a conflict and maybe it feels like you can't quite reach a resolution. You could pull from some of what we know from relationship science, from evolutionary theory, from personality psychology, and approach it in a slightly different way, and try and get at that conflict in a different way, and ultimately try and resolve that in a way that's mutually beneficial and is communal and is thinking about both persons' needs. So yeah, just use it wisely, I would say. But
Yeah, very interesting. So before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
yeah, so I think most of my stuff should be up on my website. I know I need to update that. I'm also on Twitter. My handle there is Prof. CJ Holden. I'm often tweeting preprints there that I've put together. Also, if you're familiar with OSF, you can find me pretty easily on OSF. All of my recent research is up there. So from the moment we have hypotheses to collecting data, to analyzing data, you can see all of that there. So that's probably where I would orient people primarily. But yeah, if you can't find anything out there for my work, I always welcome emails. So feel free to send me an email. It's my last name, Holden, CJ, my initials at appstate.edu. So feel free to reach out there and let me know if you have any questions with that. But yeah, those would be kind of the big three sites.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Holden, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And I really appreciate it. And it was, like I said, it was an honor. I know a number of folks from Oakland, my alma mater, have been on the show. So it feels kind of nice to be part of the Oakland family, but also part of the Dissenter family as well.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing this channel for 3 years, bringing you top academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Even $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, you also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. And please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button if you liked the interview. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Galarsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anjan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnold Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Henry Calenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omri Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adaner Usmani, my producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.